Good day, everybody, and welcome to the Evan R. Liblit Memorial Scholarship Committee's 2021 Larry Swanson Waste on Wednesday seminar series in conjunction with Stony Brook University, the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. My name is Eric Hoffmeister with the Suffolk County Department of Public Works and a 27-year solid waste veteran, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to remind everyone about the Liblit Scholarship Committee and what it does. Evan Liblit was a highly respected and loved recycling and waste professional who passed away at the age of 47 in 1995. He worked for the EPA, the New York State DEC, the town of Babylon, private sector, and was also a teacher. He was highly respected and loved by all those who knew him. After his passing, a number of his colleagues created a Liblit Scholarship Fund at Stony Brook University to continue his legacy. Over the last 23 years, the Scholarship Fund has provided scholarships to 21 plus graduate students and 16 undergraduate students. Many of the scholarship recipients have gone on to become leaders in their fields. Normally, scholarship funds are raised at an annual breakfast held each year around America Recycles Day in November, and at the Federation of Solid Waste Conference each May. Due to COVID, both have been suspended, although the scholarship has continued. I encourage anyone that is able to please consider supporting the Scholarship Fund. Prior to COVID, SUNY Stony Brook SoMAS and the Scholarship Committee hosted a symposium at Stony Brook with a capacity crowd to discuss the recycling crisis and other important waste issues that impact our region. In 2020, we adapted to a symposium to Zoom webinars, and for 2021, we held those webinars throughout April to discuss pressing regional solid waste issues. This year is special. The Liblit Scholarship Committee has renamed the Waste on Wednesday webinars after Dr. Larry Swanson of Stony Brook University. As many of you know, Larry passed away late last year. Larry's passing left a tremendous void, not only for his family, but also for his Stony Brook colleagues, the countless students whom he mentored, the professional affiliation, and groups across Long Island. The list is endless. To many of us, he was not only a gentleman, but a generally good person who inspired others and brought the right attention to matters affecting our local environment. As a founding member and strong advocate of the Liblit Scholarship Fund and symposio discussions, it was only appropriate to rename the webinars after him. In terms of logistics, everyone will be muted except for the speakers. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat box on your screen, and we will try to group them together and answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar examines the movement of solid waste, recyclables, ash, and other waste around and off Long Island. We will talk about the logistics and infrastructure that is necessary to get waste from the curb to a processing facility and to an ultimate disposal site. As we all know, this is a very complex process. The presentations today will provide you with an insider's view of the challenges associated with the daily movement of waste as we do a deep dive into the infrastructure needed to transport materials, including a look at roadways, bridges, tunnels, ports, and railroads. Our speakers today are Mr. Jerry Bogatz, Assistant Director of Planning and Program Management for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, James Bonner, President of the New York Atlantic Railway, who will be joining us on a pre-recorded video, and Michael White, Vice Chairman of the Long Island Regional Planning Council and Vice President of Special Projects for Winter Brothers. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will now turn it over to Jerry Bogatz for an overview of transportation networks and infrastructure as we use the greater New York area. Jerry?
Yes, thank you, Eric. Hope you can hear me okay. Happy to be with you today to provide this overview. And I guess what my job is here is to talk at a meta level about how freight transportation and specifically the movement of waste is happening within a very large multi-state metropolitan region. Some of the information that you will be seeing today that I'll be presenting is analysis from Moving Forward, which is our next regional transportation plan, which will be adopted later this year and will be released in June for public comment. Next slide, please, Caitlin. So a little bit about the organization I work for. The New York Metropolitan Transportation Council is a metropolitan planning organization. There are over 400 of these in the country, and they are required by federal legislation in order to bring federal transportation funding into a metropolitan region. Our planning area, as you can see from this slide, is New York City, the 5 boroughs, Nassau and Suffolk County on Long Island, and Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam County in the lower Hudson Valley. Next slide, please. Just to give you some sense of who our membership is, 5 suburban county executives, including both Nassau County and Suffolk County executives, as well as 2 New York City commissioners, the New York State Commissioner of Transportation, and the CEO of the MTA. Those are our voting members. We have a number of advisory members. Primarily among them is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which obviously plays a big role in goods movement. So that is the regional council that I work for. Next slide, please. So the freight planning context in our region is itself complicated, and so is the system for moving goods. There are state freight plans for New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania that sort of establish a statewide framework for freight planning. Within what we call the MAP forum, Metropolitan Area Planning Forum, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, there are a number of metropolitan planning organizations and councils of government in the 4 states that are looking at freight individually for their planning areas. And then within the NIMTIC planning area, which I just showed you, there are a number of freight initiatives being undertaken by New York City and by the Port Authority, as well as by bodies like the Metropolitan Rail Freight Council. All these aspects at all these different levels have to add up to a reasonable and responsible freight planning process in order for the region to move forward. Next slide, please. So some of the key characteristics of our region and our infrastructure that provide and establish some limitations for goods movement. Next slide. First, we are in the middle of a multi-state metropolitan region. You can see from this map, these are the member organizations of the MAP Forum, the Metropolitan Area Planning Forum, which is basically an organization under an agreement between these organizations to look at the larger region. But this is one of the most important economic clusters in the country. There's significant freight land use development and very high commodity tonnages and values by all modes in this area. Next slide, please. So one of the characteristics of our transportation system as it pertains to movement of goods is that major freight volumes are seen in our highway corridors, and you see some annual tonnage numbers shown here. We call this this graphic the football helmet, and it really does demonstrate how the majority of goods are moving in our region and through our region. And it's really indicative of the limitations of our transportation infrastructure with regards to good movement, as well as how it's actually moving. Next slide, please. And one characteristic that plays into that is the multiplicity of truck trip purposes. So you have goods moving into our region, you have goods moving out of our region, you have goods moving within our region at fairly high volumes. And we're also a corridor for goods moving from the Mid-Atlantic states to New England and back. So there's that corridor function also. And this just adds additional demands to our highway infrastructure. Next slide. Our freight rail is limited, and it's limited by connections across the harbor and the Hudson River. The only physical connection across the Hudson River is 120 miles north at Selkirk, which is just south of Albany. Most rail freight comes into northern New Jersey, where there are a number of intermodal facilities, and it's usually offloaded onto trucks and moved around and through the region that way. There is rail freight that does move up to Selkirk and back down on the the east side of the Hudson River. And of course, there is a float bridge operation across New York Harbor that brings some rail freight across from New Jersey and into the Long Island Railroad system, as well as other locations. But this really helps to determine how much of our freight is moving in our region by truck as opposed to rail, because of the lack of physical connections for the system. Next slide. And due to the fact that those physical limitations exist, there's obviously a geographic imbalance of multimodal facilities. So even if you have the connections with rail freight, you need places to offload the freight and move it out to its final destination, unless you have a lot of sidings, and we don't. So this is a further limitation to expansion of rail freight. Most of the multimodal facilities are obviously in northern New Jersey. Next slide. And we can't overlook the fact that we have major port facilities in our region, mostly in New Jersey, but some in New York City also. And these also add to the pressure that truck movements put on our already congested highway system, moving goods throughout our region. Next slide, please. So in looking at our new freight plan, we were able to obtain commodity flow data from Transearch in the 2018 base year. That data was purchased by New York State Department of Transportation and made available to the metropolitan planning organizations in New York State. A lot of the information you'll be seeing in the subsequent slides is from that Transearch database. We've also used USDOT's freight analysis framework. Level 4 is a 2012 base year, but that's being updated to level 5, which will be a 2017 base year. So we have a pretty robust set of information about how commodities are moving domestically and internationally based on these sources. Next slide. From the analysis of that data, the critical supply chains in our region are listed below here. There are 6 essential commodity groups that comprise 90% of regional tonnage. Not surprisingly, waste is one of those. As you can see, food, parcels and secondary freight, construction materials, energy products, pharmaceutical drugs are also on the list. Secondary freight and parcels is really interesting because that's really materials that are moving within our region. They're moving from, say, warehouses and distribution centers to their ultimate destinations. And COVID is playing a role in the acceleration of those movements. But as you can see from the last bullet, waste, 63% of it is outbound from the region. 87% of that is moved by truck, 3% by water, and 9% by rail. And that's one of the most significant rail percentages that we have for any of these 6 commodities. And of course, that's an important part of the waste movement in our region. Next slide. So these are domestic flows by direction. Not surprisingly, there's a 2-to-1 ratio of inbound to outbound flows. So there's much more moving into our region than moving out of our region. You can see the huge amount and the worth, the value of these goods, 655 billion tons and $1 trillion. And about 1/3 of the tons in value stay within the map form region. So these are goods and materials that are moving within our region as opposed to in or out or through. Next slide, please. Modally, again, this should not be surprising, but there's a high reliance on trucking. And again, this goes not only to the convenience of trucking and the fact that goods generally are moved by truck more than any other mode, but also the limitations of the rail freight infrastructure certainly make trucking even more important in our region and even more dominant. So water is important for lower value domestic commodities, and rail is important primarily for higher value goods, which is not typical. Air has negligible tonnage, but a very significant share of value. But when you look at the tonnage being moved, almost 90% of that is by truck. Rail comes in at about 3.3%, water about 8.5%. Next slide. I should point out that, again, all these numbers are 2018, which is obviously pre-COVID. So unfortunately, commodity flow information isn't available on a regular basis. It has to be purchased at various points in time when it's available. And therefore, we do not have, good information on the impacts of COVID on the commodity tonnage, but we have some anecdotal information I'll be sharing shortly. You can see here the leading commodities by tonnage that are being moved. And again, none of this is really surprising given the 6 commodity flows that are most significant. Waste, scrap, and mixed directions, truck and outbound rail are all part of the mix in terms of these leading commodities by tonnage. Next slide. And finally, looking into the future, we were forecasting that tonnage is going to grow to almost 40%. Again, this was all from pre-COVID information, and this COVID may have an impact, although not necessarily in the longer term, certainly in the immediate term. Value is going to be higher too, 62% higher. So that's outpacing the growth in population and GDP. And that's really due to a number of factors: more productivity, more consumption per capita, more transportation per unit of production. And I don't know why these bullets overlapped. I apologize for that. But there are a number of disruptors, though, that could play a role in these future trends. Certainly, COVID is accelerating the already rapid growth in e-commerce. We're seeing that. It's also generating more pressure on changes in warehouse design and less-than-truckload services in order to respond to the demand for e-commerce. And, in the future, distributed manufacturing, i.e. 3D printing and trade reshoring impacts could also have significant impacts on these forecasted trends. But it's impossible at this point to really predict how that's going to play out in terms of distributed manufacturing. Next slide. So some of the key trends very quickly that we're looking at. First of all, we started looking at land use, industrial land use in our region. And the interesting part here is the fact that there's a huge amount of growth over the last 10, 20 years in Eastern Pennsylvania. And of course, Northern New Jersey also plays a great role. The reason for that growth in distribution centers and warehouses and so forth is simply the availability of land and relative cheapness of land. And that's, affecting how goods move around our region. Next slide. If you look at the trends in that land use, you can see that although New York is actually losing some industrial land, New Jersey has the most, and the trend is generally increasing over the last 20 years. Pennsylvania has a smaller amount, but its trend is increasing more dramatically, and Connecticut tends to be flat. So these are some initial land use study findings that are very interesting and really play a role in how this is all going to play out in terms of the internal movements and also the rise of e-commerce. Next slide. E-commerce growth before the pandemic was significant. On the left, you see that it had gotten up to a forecast of 14 to 15% of total retail. And the forecast on the right would take that up to close to 40% in the long term. And the impacts of COVID will only accelerate these trends. Next slide. Related to that is less-than-truckload. Relatively small freight being shipped. The industry is 10% larger than it was pre-recession. That's the Great Recession. And again, this is also being accelerated by COVID. But the industry is also looking to optimize shipment sizes and so forth. And it's playing a growing role in home delivery. So the effects on the supply chain of all these trends: smaller shipments, greater frequency, more delivery trucks, more terminals closer to customers, and driver pool issues. Next slide. Also being driven by this is warehouse design and automation, both the location of warehouses and distribution centers, how they operate, whether they're in closer to the urban core or whether they're in outlying areas, and what kind of freight generation they're producing in these areas. And Eastern Pennsylvania is a prime example of that, where freight generation has been transformed there over the last 10 to 20 years. And so has land use based on what's happening. Next slide. Now, disruptors, unpredictable events that can dramatically influence or upset production, consumption, and so forth. And the resiliency of the system is the ability to withstand and quickly recover from disruptors. So we've seen the effect of weather events, and we've seen the effects of terrorism in our region, and managing those risks, preventing them if possible, but managing them is certainly part of the plan going forward. But if you see in the next slide, one of the major disruptors we've seen, next slide, Caitlin, is in fact the public health emergency. And we must remember that it's not over yet. We may be approaching the end game of it, but it's still in play, and it's still changing the way we live and the way our goods move. You can see the business and employment impacts anecdotally, what industries are losing in this situation, what are being hit the hardest, what the freight transportation impacts are. Although port and rail volumes are relatively stable, trucking volume was down, especially the long haul. However, deliveries were up. So, you're looking at different parts of the trucking and supply chain. And the supply chain impacts obvious acceleration of e-commerce, purchasing and direct delivery trends, pressure on truck services, and pressure on fulfillment space, repurposing parking garages, retail space, etc., micro warehousing, anything to move closer to and make a more efficient operation to fulfill the increased demand for home delivery. I believe that's the last slide. No, I'm sorry, there's one more. So one more, Caitlin. Just specifically on waste movement, these are a number of tables that really summarize waste movement in our region. As you can see in the upper left, the domestic tonnage by county and direction, both Suffolk and Nassau County move significant amount of waste and tonnage. Most of that is outbound from the NIMTIC counties or between, although there is some movement within in Suffolk County also because of the landfills. The domestic tonnage below that by mode and direction, movement by truck outbound from NIMTIC is by far and away the highest amount, but you see some significant movements by truck between NIMTIC counties and inbound. And you also see the most predominant rail is outbound from NIMTIC, so waste is being moved by rail out of the region. None of that is very surprising. And then you can see some of the domestic tonnage and value by mode and direction in the right-hand table, which is also projected to 2045. And the bottom line there is that roughly 29.4 million tons annually is projected to rise to 40.7 based on population and employment figures and economic projections. So we are looking at an issue with waste movement that is growing, and the new innovative ways to move waste and environmentally sensitive ways to move waste will certainly be at a premium as we move into the future. So Caitlin, I believe that is the last slide. And thank you again for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Jerry, thank you very much for this informative presentation on your council and the freight rail system in our region. At this point, we are going to move on. We will do questions at the end. I do see some coming in the chat, but now we're going to move on to James Bonner's pre-recorded video. I'd like to thank him for taking the time to put this together for us to be able to keep this slot in today's presentations. And I'd also like to extend a thank you to Caitlin. She is our best behind the scenes guru here that's helping out quite a bit. And Caitlin, if you would, could you please start the video?
Good afternoon. I'm James Bonner, President of New York and Atlantic Railway. I'd like to thank the organizers and Mr. Hoffmeister for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm honored to be part of this impactful panel. New York and Atlantic Railway is part of Anacostia Rail Holdings, a New York-based company that owns and operates short-line freight railroads across the United States. NYA has operated the Long Island Railroad freight lease since 1997, connecting this region with numerous railroads, including the CSX, Norfolk Southern, New York, New Jersey Rail, Providence and Worcester, Canadian Pacific, and Brookhaven Rail Terminal. NYA places the highest priority on a safe railroad operation, and we've received numerous awards recognizing our safety performance. The railroad holds the right to operate over 270 route miles owned by Long Island Railroad, making us the 5th largest freight railroad in the state. We operate in both freight-only territory, which means you won't see any passenger trains alongside ours, as well as joint use territory, which means we're operating on the same tracks used by Long Island Railroad passenger equipment often in close proximity. Our scheduling often necessitates operations during off-peak times so as not to interfere with the Long Island Railroad's main objective, which is, of course, moving passengers to their destination. We serve Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island, providing inbound and outbound freight to more than 80 customers. We support companies that feed and hydrate the region, heat your homes, improve building and infrastructure, offer outlets for waste, and engage in printing, box production, and recycling. We are a local company. We're your neighbors. We live, we work here. Therefore, we share your concerns about our air quality, road congestion, wear and tear to roads and bridges. To that end, we utilize state-of-the-art emissions reducing technology on all of the locomotives that we own, reducing emissions and saving thousands of gallons of fuel each year. On a per ton basis, the freight rail industry produces 75% less carbon dioxide than the trucking industry. Did you know that one rail car can carry the equivalent of 4 trucks, significantly reducing the region's growing traffic congestion? We can all agree that this is a critical concern for our region. As a matter of fact, just one New York and Atlantic 50-car train can haul the same amount of cargo as 200 trucks. Freight rail can save on bulk shipping costs because of increased fuel efficiency, reduced tolls, which continue to rise, and other economies of scale. These savings translate directly to better goods availability and reduced expense in our daily lives, as well as less pollution and fewer long-haul trucks on our highways. In closing, I'm often asked whether there is additional capacity for freight rail on Long Island. That answer is yes. We're pleased to be part of an environmentally friendly and sound solution to congestion problems in our region. Additional temporal capacity exists for freight rail on Long Island. NYA is committed to meeting current needs and working with all stakeholders to ensure the reliable and efficient movement of goods continues to benefit all of us, now and in the future. On behalf of New York and Atlantic's team of safe, highly trained professional employees and the thousands of jobs in our region that we have the opportunity to support, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Caitlin. Again, the team extends a thank you to James for his video presentation today and participating in this webinar today. Up next is going to be Michael White, who is Vice Chairman of the Long Island Regional Planning Council and Vice President of Special Projects for Winter Brothers. Michael, if you'd take over.
Sure. Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for this opportunity. So basically, this first slide you're looking at is kind of an overview of what we're working on today with this symposium, an overview of the transportation system that Jerry has provided. Great and interesting statistics and presentation from James from New York and Atlantic. I'm going to focus on the movement of waste and recyclables on Long Island as well as off Long Island, and why transportation of waste is a critical environmental and economic concern, some of which I think you probably already captured from the comments that Jerry and James have already provided. Next slide, Caitlin. So let's start with some basic foundation information. We look at a number of 4.6 pounds per person per day, with an approximate 2.8 million people on Long Island. By Long Island, we mean, in this case, Nassau and Suffolk counties. That's over 13 million pounds per day, 365 days per year, gives us the bold figure at the bottom, over 2.3 million tons per year. I would also add that while these are good numbers to work with, given what we're seeing in today's trends, as well as looking to capture all the waste that's generated in all waste categories, these are probably, as high as they are, still conservative numbers. Next slide, Caitlin. So just some context here. As Jerry provided the background and what clearly came through in terms of our limitations on infrastructure, this is an issue that's been in the news. Most recently, April 7th, front page of Newsday. So we already know this, but what we need to know is how we can try to resolve this issue and address this heavy traffic that we're facing. So when we look at the transportation issues that involve waste, as many other commodities as well, is we have the overall congestion problem. We clearly have stress on already overcrowded and aging infrastructure. That's bridges, roadways, tunnels. We have the pollution issue. So clearly in Long Island, we have an air quality issue. We are a non-attainment area for several parameters of the Clean Air Act. We'd like to move away from that if we can. And then we look at the economic costs. The loss of productivity, as mentioned in this article that we referenced, the increased cost of doing business on Long Island because of the time it takes to move. And clearly, what I haven't listed here, but we all know very well, is the quality of life, the stress that congestion and traffic puts on people, and how anxious we get if we're late. Next slide. So similarly, an earlier front page on Newsday, this was September 25th, 2020, Gridlock Island. And we on Long Island know how this feels. And what this article talked about was 81 hours a year that we lose, people like us driving around. And it's getting worse. Those are 85 hours we could be doing something else, productivity, home, or whatever. So again, laying the framework and moving from the comments and the very technical comments that Jerry has provided to, we see this in the media and it's being recognized. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the basic foundations of movement of waste on Long Island. We have the collection of residential waste from the curb, goes to transfer stations or to incinerators. We have the collection of commercial waste, and this would be sort of, let's call it the point of generation of the commercial waste, to transfer stations and incinerators. We have the collection of other waste, the yard waste, the storm debris, and so forth, as well as recyclables, again, from the point of generation to transfer or processing centers. The movement of municipal solid waste from transfer stations to incinerators or off island. We have the movement of construction and demolition debris from transfer stations to landfills on and off Long Island. The movement of processed recyclables to markets, and the movement of ash from the incinerators that we have in Nassau and Suffolk County to a landfill. Next slide. So how do these wastes move? Several categories. So first, let's look at your basic standard garbage truck. Curb to incinerator, curb to transfer station, curb to recycling facility. And of course, with respect to the commercial, we have from point of generation, again, to potentially a transfer station or incinerator. And again, on island for C&D and off island for MSW. Then we go to the tractor trailer movement. So these are the 100 plus cubic yard tractor trailers. Again, movement from transfer stations to incinerator, from transfer station to a landfill, the two landfills on Long Island that do take construction and demolition debris, from recycling facilities to manufacturing facilities, secondary processing, or markets, let's call them. And so between the garbage trucks at 800 trucks per day and the tractor trailers at 500 trucks per day, and again, I would note that I still believe these figures are conservative, but we're certainly giving you a context and a perspective on what these numbers look like. Then we go to the railroad. So basically the rail movement is from a transfer station to disposal sites off of Long Island. Presently, there's construction and demolition debris moving off Long Island by rail, and that's approximately 25 rail cars per day. And then we have the barge. So we've had a lot of comments about this. Many of us who've been in the business for a long time still recall the horror of the garbage barge, but we are on an island. So it's something to still be considered. Okay, there is nothing moved by barge on Nassau and Suffolk County at this time, but I would note that New York City does use a barge system to move wastes around the city. Next slide. So now I'm going to go to a series of some pictures. Many of you have probably already seen this in pictures and or live. The first one on the left side, classic rear loader residential collection. And of course, we know how this operates. You can have a driver and a helper, a driver and two helpers, places around the country, and we'd like to see more potentially automated residential collection. But this is the classic of what we see on the left. On the right-hand side shows a truck of the size that we see being in the collection system, delivering materials to a transfer station. This looks more like it's the recyclables. And again, from the transfer station, this is paper and cardboard. That's going to move off to a recycling facility where it can be sorted and then onto markets. Next slide. So some more pictures, waste transfer. On the left, we see a waste transfer facility. I believe that's the town of Smithtown. And on the right-hand side, we see one of our burn plants, energy from waste facility. So this is basically MSW, municipal solid waste in and ash out. I believe this facility is the Huntington Smithtown Covanta facility, which is handling Huntington residential, Smithtown residential and commercial, as well as some spot commercial waste. Next slide. Again, some more pictures on the left-hand side when I talked about transfer station movement. So here we have materials being loaded onto or into a tractor trailer. If it's C&D, that could go to one of our landfills. If it's MSW, it's probably going to go potentially even to a baling facility or off island as just MSW in that tractor trailer. On the right-hand side gives you an idea of what it looks like inside the tipping floor of one of our burn plants on the island. Basically, you have a tractor trailer here delivering waste into a very large and deep pit, and the left-hand side shows the grapple, wherein how the waste in the pit gets into the burner system. Next slide. So here we're looking at some landfilling, and you see basically in these pictures tractor trailers going to the landfill. So for the most part, this is what we would call process construction demolition debris. There's a whole nother line of this waste that we might call retail, where you see just the construction and demolition in roll-offs that either goes to a pre-processing facility or can also be shipped off island as well. And we see on the right-hand side, so years passed, and past practice was in many cases filling a hole, whether it be a sand mine or natural depression with waste. We are now seeing what we have are mountains of waste. Next slide. So I want to show this one. Jerry mentioned this earlier. This is something new, although it's existed for a while. This is not a garbage barge, but it does show a very important movement opportunity by rail. It's fairly new and most recently extremely improved. Basically, you have these freight cars are freight cars that have moved off of Long Island or around Long Island and off of Long Island to this car float system. And the car float system will be taking, and that's in New Jersey. It goes from New York and Atlantic to the Brooklyn area, and it goes on this car float. It will go over to New Jersey. And right now, as you can see here, there's various commodities as well as empty rail cars on it. Next slide. So this is another picture. Again, you're seeing it moving off into the waterways and traveling across New York Harbor, basically. This operation is run by New York and New Jersey Rail. It's a very unique short line railroad. It's really part of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. These new car floats are handling 18 rail cars on the float. And presently at that piece of infrastructure, we're looking at potentially 24,000 rail cars annually. So this again, from New York and Atlantic to the car float to New Jersey, connecting with the Conrail system and then to various other Class 1 railroads. So this is a real option for rail. So for the most part, rail freight moves through Queens to the Bronx, and Jerry pointed out how it goes up and down the Hudson. This one is a Brooklyn to New Jersey over this car float. I would mention also that this route that pretty much this car float takes is still the subject of someday a potential railroad tunnel between Brooklyn and New Jersey. That's been studied by the federal government for quite some time. Maybe we see it at some point in the future. Next slide. So I want to spend a little time on this diagram. Take a look at what we're looking at here is waste flows on Long Island. So let's start with the orange lines and dots. So this is basically municipal solid waste going to the burn plants. Then we look at the black lines. That is the ash coming out of those burn plants that goes to the Brookhaven landfill. That's approximately 350,000 tons a year. The only ash from a energy from waste facility that does not go to the Brookhaven landfill is from Babylon, because Babylon has its own ash monofill. Then we look at the yellow/gold. This is showing municipal solid waste moving off Long Island. I would also add that we could, in addition to what you're seeing here, we could put an overlay with respect to commercial waste. And what you would see is a huge amount of commercial MSW. So that would be, let's say, from Huntington, from Oyster Bay, from Islip, from Brookhaven, and the East End towns moving off of Long Island. Next slide. So how did we get here? We all recognize that Long Island has significant unique challenges with respect to managing solid waste. We go back to the Long Island landfill law adopted in 1983, which basically prohibits the landfilling of putrescible MSW on Long Island. So what we have is the MSW being generated in Long Island can be disposed of at on-island energy from waste facilities, which clearly do not have sufficient capacity to handle all of the waste MSW that's generated on Long Island. And so we have thousands of tons of waste being trucked off Long Island for disposals at landfills, whether it be in the state or out of the state. And another important feature that we really like to acknowledge that on Long Island, and this is part of our uniqueness as well, the solid waste management program is achieved really through a public-private partnership. So industry is working with municipalities to serve municipalities and be part of that investment in infrastructure as well as performing services. Next slide. So the crisis. The amount of waste generated on Long Island is increasing. Our population is growing. The per capita waste generation rates are increasing. And I'll mention a little while later, one of the initiatives that we're seeing more about, which is crucially important, is this concept of zero waste. Rather than watching this per capita waste generation increase, we need to find the ways to reduce that. But in any case, looking at the present situation, we have thousands of tons of waste shipped off Long Island each day for disposal at distant landfills. And as Jerry mentioned, as a whole, this waste crisis, or this waste movement crisis, provides a problem, or the consequences rather, a roadway and bridge infrastructure for long-haul truck transportation is moving over highly burdened and aging infrastructure. And because of this, and the time that we mentioned, as even mentioned in the media reports that I showed, we have an increasingly more expensive options and with high carbon footprint if we stick to this truck transportation. Next slide. More on the crisis. So the Brookhaven landfill will close in 2024. Brookhaven landfill is one of two landfills for construction and demolition debris that we have on Long Island. Current volumes that are going into, and over the years have been going into the Brookhaven landfill, approximately 720,000 tons per year of construction and demolition debris, approximately 350,000 tons per year of ash from the incinerators, which I mentioned earlier, and also approximately 100,000 tons per year of auto fluff from auto shredding operations. So the key part of this, the crisis, after the Brookhaven landfill closes, there will be only one construction and demolition debris landfill, the 110 Sand Company on Long Island, and no landfills for incinerator ash, with the exception of Babylon, which has its own ash monofill, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So any additional demand for trucks to transport and dispose of C&D off island will further stress the current infrastructure and disrupt market economics, meaning increased costs. Costs are going to increase for all generators of waste. So those are municipalities, residences, homeowners, commercial establishments, institutions around Nassau and Suffolk County. And to successfully address the closure of the Brookhaven landfill, We talk about several items. Again, one I've already mentioned, which probably should be more at the top of this list in terms of up and coming, let's get inspired and focus on zero waste, reducing the volumes of waste. But we also have to be a lot more diligent at producing more recycling, more participation, more items to be recycled. And then the improvement of the transportation infrastructure for off-island disposal, specifically expand rail transport for construction and demolition debris, municipal solid waste, and potentially an incinerator ash. And as I mentioned earlier, we are on an island and we do have that sort of bad memory of a garbage barge, but there really needs to be some further consideration of watercraft transportation of waste. Next slide. Again, a little bit more on a summary of the steps. So in terms of coordinating and planning for the closure of the Brookhaven landfill, and I think it's really important to mention here the leadership that Supervisor Romaine has provided, not only on overall solid waste planning and focusing attention on this crisis, a very difficult decision where Brookhaven considered the opportunity of potentially continuing an ash monofill at the landfill. In other words, potentially stopping construction and demolition debris and just using it for an ash monofill. And so the decision was very strong in favor of the concerns to the residences and the people in the community that were expressed, as well as a financial impact of constructing and operating such facility. But again, Supervisor Romaine has been a leader. I mentioned with respect to recycling, Brookhaven has the I would say the best and largest recycling facility on the island. So we need to work with this problem that is going to be facing us in a very short period of time. Going through some of the points: transport and disposal of construction and demolition debris, incinerator ash, and other waste going into landfills. Consideration of an ash monofill at the Brookhaven landfill, but again, that was considered and rejected. I just talked a little bit about that. Leaving again only the Babylon ashfill. So plan to develop enhanced transportation structure and facilities, working with Long Island Railroad, the New York Atlantic Railway, to foster a more robust freight transportation system. Jerry gave you some of the statistics about how much is moved by truck and how much is presently moved by rail. And James presented that situation of more capacity being available for rail freight on Long Island. So if we look at this list that I put together here, potentially there's a solid waste rail transfer facility that's proposed for Brentwood, the Omni Brentwood facility. It's not been permitted by the state, but it's waiting for approvals, and I guess we'll see if that does happen. Winters Brothers Shamrock Rail project in Yaphank, that's something certainly I'm very familiar with that we are working on, and really working and coordinating those efforts with the town of Brookhaven. We have the Gershel Metals and Rail Development Facility in Medford. The town has issued special use permits for that. And then the two last ones, I mentioned earlier, there were two existing waste by rail facilities off of Long Island. These are the two: Coastal Distribution, which is in Farmingdale, and One World Recycling, which is in Lindenhurst. But again, looking to address the future, we will see, and we must address the cost impact to all businesses and municipalities as these changes occur, and we try to control those costs. And again, increase recycling efforts. On-island solutions are needed. We need to start looking at potentially secondary processing of recyclables, manufacturing of materials from recyclables. We've taken a look at this idea of perhaps a glass-to-glass facility. People don't recognize that, okay, we do have these enormous, very popular, very successful wineries on Long Island, but the bottles for those wineries are coming from Europe. Maybe it's time to consider a glass-to-glass manufacturing for our Long Island wineries and other beverages. So, and by the way, that has the added feature of economic development and job creation. So I guess we go to discussion and thought sharing and Q&A. Caitlin.
Okay, Michael, thank you for today's presentation. We have about 10 minutes left today for today's webinar. Let's take a look at some of the questions, and then we're going to have Mike Cahill close things out for today. So we're going to go to 12:58 on the questions from a time standpoint, and then we'll hand it over to Mike for the last 2 minutes. So what's the best way to do the questions here, Caitlin? Just look at them, I guess.
I can read them out if you'd like.
Sure, that'd be great.
So one of the questions was regarding the first presentation, and it was asking if, I guess, all of the waste was domestic, no import or export, which would be significant. For instance, recyclables are exported, lots of materials come into the area and they get offloaded onto trucks, etc.
Yeah, so I looked into that while the other presentations were going on. Right, the waste that is being counted by this by Transearch is basically municipal solid waste and construction and demolition, and so recyclables are essentially taken out of the waste stream. I don't know actually where they would show up in the Transearch data specifically, but they would not show up in those waste numbers. Similarly, I think I saw a question about zero waste, which obviously would reduce the waste stream, and that would that growth forecast in waste would be mitigated to some extent by significant movement to zero waste. What Transearch is measuring, though, is the waste stream itself in terms of MSW and construction and demolition.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how will the Biden administration's focus on infrastructure benefit transportation? What areas of transportation will see the benefits first?
Well, more money is always nice. So I think one of the areas, and our long range planning has consistently shown over the years that we have an extensive transportation system, and it tends to be old. And I'm including everything in that: roads, bridges, transit systems, and so forth. It tends to be old, and therefore most of our long-term financial forecasts show that something on the order of 90 to 95% of the resources we can reasonably expect to receive in the future from the federal government, from the state, and from local participation are likely to go right back out for system preservation, for achieving and maintaining a state of good repair. And that leaves a very small percentage for enhancing the system. And our members have been exploring all kinds of innovative ways to produce those system enhancements, even in light of the fact that there's such an overhead in system preservation. Additional funding, though, from the federal government certainly could help with some of those very important system expansions, including things like the Cross Harbor Rail Tunnel that Michael mentioned, and I failed to mention because it's now a float bridge, could be a rail tunnel. It has been looked at for many years. It's in a phase 2 environmental impact statement at this point. And, that could potentially come to pass with additional money, which would have a great deal of impact on freight rail in our region.
And just to add to Jerry's information there, working at Suffolk County, I've been on some calls regarding the infrastructure bills and programs that may be coming out by the president. And high-speed rail is one of those things that's on the list that could achieve rail travel from New York to Boston in 1 hour. I'm not sure what that does for freight, but they're talking about trillions of dollars for that kind of infrastructure coming our way.
What is the potential round trip via rail from Long Island to Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Alabama?
Well, presently, if we look at the facilities that are operated on Long Island, and I think it's fair to say going forward, it's probably on any individual rail car, it's probably what we would call 2 turns per month. So you're talking about a couple of weeks when you send the car out for that car to come back. And that would be Ohio.
Thank you. This one's for Mike. It says, can you address carrying capacity? Endless growth needs limits as per water, land, air quality, availability. I hear nothing of that coming from the LIRPC. Planning, it seems, should not be in a survival vacuum. What about growth limits?
So I think that's a very, it's a good question. It's an interesting question, but again, we all recognize that on Long Island, land use is controlled by what we call land use authorities, and those are the towns and villages. I think entities like the Regional Planning Council, entities like NIMTEC can produce transportation plans and find ways to bring those forward and produce some goodwill with those land use authorities. But those are the decision makers on that. But it's a very good point. At some point, we do have to consider, and by the way, Larry Swanson was very good on this one. He's given several lectures during his years on this idea of have we or will we reach carrying capacity on Long Island? So it's a very serious question.
Thank you.
Caitlin, we
How
have time for one more.
Yep. How much plastic waste in the form of PET, HDPE, and PPR and the like are consolidated into bales and shipped off of Long Island annually?
I will tell you, I don't have that number at my fingertips, but we could certainly provide it and hopefully get it out to everybody, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. And I think that answers most of the questions.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Michael. Once again, I'd like to thank all three of our speakers today. And I'd like to, thank this group for having me on today. I'm now going to ask a good friend of mine of 33 or 34 years, Mike Cahill, to close things out. And one last fun fact for today, Michael mentioned the ISOP garbage barge. And just so everyone knows, the actual name of the barge was the Mobro 4000. That's today's fun fact. Michael, if you'll take over.
Well, thank you, Eric. And I'd like to thank everyone who presented today. Jerry, Michael White, James Bonner for a wonderfully informative presentation. And I'd also like to thank everyone who presented so far this spring on other topics that we've had since April 7th, our Waste 101 series, the update on recycling. So I thought a very interesting presentation on food waste, and today, of course, was very informative. We would hope to see you all next fall. We're going to return to our symposium format, but possibly as a hybrid, I hope, if we can. And we most of all hope to see everyone at an in-person annual Liblit Scholarship Fund breakfast in November. We'll be considering another scholarship as September rolls along, and that's what we do, and that's what we really look forward to. But we've really enjoyed being able to present and hope we've presented some informative sessions in our last couple of series in the Waste on Wednesdays format. But I would like to also urge everyone, I think in about 2 weeks, the New York State Federation of Recycling and Solid Waste Management Organizations, SWANA, NYSA-SWAM, and NYSAR3, are holding the Federation Conference virtually. And there are, I believe, a great number of interesting speakers there. And they have all been very supportive of the Liblit Foundation Fund for many, many years. And we urge you all to tune in to the Strive for Sustainability show program coming up in May. And with that, I thank everyone once again, and I hope that we will see you soon in the fall. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.